Nikki Haley there essentially was talking about this notion that Trump now needs to earn the support of people who voted for her. Can they do that? Can he do that? Or are those voters likely to go elsewhere?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. That's the challenge for Donald Trump. Obviously, they ran a very well-run primary campaign. Chris LaCivita knows what he's doing. This was a lot better organized than 2020 when he was an incumbent, or in 2016 when he ran as a celebrity. They ran a great campaign, but that slice of voters who have concerns about Donald Trump, as do I, are going to watch how this next phase of the campaign plays out. Just last week, for example, when former President Trump made his comment about Putin being free to do what he wanted with countries that weren't meeting their defense contribution obligation to NATO, that kind of reckless comment has consequences, at least to those of us old-fashioned Republicans who believe that you have to conduct yourself in a certain way. So that's going to be the challenge, to see if Donald Trump can bring those voters who have these kind of concerns into the party, much like President Biden has a challenge to bring some of his base back home.
Mm-hmm. Steve, when you gathered party faithful at the Snowshoe Club in Concord, New Hampshire on the eve of the primary, everything was still possible. Now that we're here, and I know you hold this group closely in the first in the nation primary state, if I can still call it that, is it now time for a conversation about a third party run, a no labels ticket?
No, I don't hear much talk about that. Frankly, I think people who are strongly against President Trump would see a no labels candidate as drawing more votes away from President Biden than from President Trump. And the history of third party candidates shows they don't work, they don't win. I think the two-party system's just too well entrenched. I mean, but for Ross Perot, George Herbert Walker Bush would have been president a second term, and Bill Clinton would have been a former governor of Arkansas. So I don't think there's any discussion of that. I think the people who are for Nikki Haley or other candidates in the primary are going to sit back. They're going to watch out how the trial issues that are still pending in front of President Trump play out. They're going to watch how he conducts himself in the campaign. They're going to watch how President Biden does as well. And I think that's going to be a late-breaking group, but a lot of it's centered around suburban, college-educated women. And I think in the battleground states, that's going to be the real battleground.
Steve, I want to return to a way you just described yourself a minute ago as, I think you said, an old-school Republican. And there's a lot of conversation happening today about how this is kind of not just the death knell of Nikki Haley's 2024 campaign, but it might be, too, for a different Republican Party, the Reagan-esque Republican Party, if you will. And especially as we consider Nikki Haley's political future, do you think there's going to be a place for her even looking forward to 2028, or is the party just too different now?
Well, the party's certainly different, and I remember those discussions when Ronald Reagan came along. And yes, I am a Ronald Reagan, John McCain Republican through and through. These movements have phases. They ebb and they flow. The success of Donald Trump in 2016 is that he realized before any other candidate, and better than any other candidate, that people are upset with both parties and they think there's a lot of talk, not much action. They have no respect for Congress. They don't see problems getting solved, and they're fed up. And he was voice to that. He was very brilliant in picking that as a theme. These kinds of ebb tides flow, they ebb. And 4 years from now, it could be a very, very different party. Who knows? And so I do think there is a future for people like Nikki Haley. And regardless of whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden wins, in 4 years, there'll be an open race on both sides, which likely means a dozen candidates on each side. And each new cycle, the party redefines itself.
We spoke with your governor, Chris Anunu, 2 days ago, of course, made the case passionately for Nikki Haley. Did he help deliver New Hampshire to Joe Biden in the general election?
Well, keep in mind that Joe Biden won New Hampshire before, and our entire congressional delegation is Democratic. So they're pretty good at winning elections in New Hampshire. We truly have become a purple state. I don't think Chris Anunu delivered the state for Joe Biden, because Chris said very clearly he would support Donald Trump if he were the nominee. But I think it's going to be a very tough race for President Trump here, because it's a very purple state. And Chris was a governor who fit the time and the electorate.
Would you vote for Biden Steve, in the absence of Nikki Haley, if it's just those two choices, Trump or Biden?
I haven't made up my mind, but what is paramount in my mind is I want a president who I'm proud of, regardless of the party, that they conduct themselves with the seriousness and with the stature and the gravity in the world and to our citizens of the United States with the kind of decorum and respect for the office that has been the hallmark of every president since the history of our republic, that is embracing, that brings us together, not divides us. And I think Donald Trump has a chance to win those votes. I'm going to watch how this plays out, like I think lots of voters are on both sides of the aisle.
Interesting the way you chose to answer that, Steve. To what extent will the State of the Union address tomorrow night factor into that decision?
I think everything that happens between now and the election, the status of the criminal trials against former President Trump, how President Biden either grapples with or solves the immigration problem. You know, you wouldn't think in New Hampshire people would be worried much about immigration. The economy clearly is the number one issue, but people in both parties are upset with the immigration issue. And frankly, I don't think if President Biden doesn't take some very definitive steps very quickly, I think that issue alone could turn this election.